international panel. And just by way of introduction, we're going to show a short trailer about Push the film, which has been released in a few of your countries, but you can find it on the website and you can book it for public showings. But this is just a trailer today because the actual film is about an hour and a half long. And following this, I'll invite Erik Elmgren, who's the chief negotiator and head of the housing department, and his panelists onto the stage. But this gives a flavor of what the film is about.
Y no ellos, como inmobiliaria no lo han pedido permiso.
Y volaron todos los árboles, no hay nada. El parque Barón, la palabra parque es cero.
A new owner came and took possession of the building. They were breaking locks for the main entrance for the building. They were physically pushing their way into people's apartments upstairs.
I hear stories of nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters who are unable to afford to live in the city where they're supposed to be guarding and helping. I'm giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy.
They came after her with the hardest category they could. The neighborhood's getting gentrified. It's moving. It's come right up to King and Dufferin, and it's only one direction into our neighbor, and we're in the way.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is if only. It's much deeper than that.
Housing has become overly financialized, so it's like gold. But gold is not a human right. Housing is.
They want to raise each apartment, they'll rent up to like $900 each. If it goes to $3,400, I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
Schools are closing down in areas where there's a concentration of vacant housing. Shops are closing down, restaurants are closing down. You lose the diversity and the richness of a city.
These dark, empty buildings, and they are making money. So when people think, oh, poor investors, something went wrong, hell no.
One of the councillors said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. What's all that about? Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
Preparing for a meeting with the largest landlord in the U.S., what questions would you have the special rapporteur ask, depending on who I meet there?
You might want to go big picture, you know? Ask them what they think their obligation is as a corporate citizen.
If I can get them to talk about the human side of this, then we might get somewhere. They canceled the meeting.
Oh, shit.
Are you a legal scholar actually on human rights, or is you just okay?
Yes,
So
that's right.
You have the instrumentality that is the law.
Exactly.
Because what I see is those with power, boy, can they deploy the law in ways that work for them. Stuff is happening, you know?
Okay, everybody, let's go to the international stage and we will discuss the Push movie. How many of you have actually seen this movie? Yeah? Great. Just for a short introduction to you who hasn't seen the film, it's a documentary, of course, of the global housing crisis. It's a film about making cities unaffordable to live in. And in the film, you will follow the UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, Leilani Farah, who is traveling all around the world. And she's trying to understand a global phenomena about people being pushed out of cities and why this is happening. And in the film, you meet a lot of character. You saw this man from Harlem in New York, who spends about 90% of his income on a flat. Soon his two-bedroom apartment will cost $3,600 per month. So people are being pushed out of their very own homes because living in them has become unaffordable. And people are actually dying all over the world because of evictions. And as Leilana said in the film, gold is a commodity, housing is not. It's a basic human right. And with that short introduction, I would like to welcome an international panel. Penny Carr from Queensland, Australia. Welcome up. And applaud, of course. And Elizabeth Pam from Quebec in Canada. And also Gerard van Bortel from the Vombond board and also a professor at Delft University. So we will talk about the movie for maybe 20 minutes, and then we will have round-table discussions inside here. But my first question, and we can start with you, Penny. What's your overall reaction of the film, The Push?
I think there's some universal themes across the world happening in the film. I think in Australia itself it's probably playing out a little bit differently because we don't have a lot of institutional investors. We have more than something like 70% of investors in Australia are what we call mum and dad investors. So they own one property and but increasingly we're seeing an investment class, so people owning more than one property. So there's a massive wealth divide occurring in Australia based on the ownership of property. So housing's becoming extremely unaffordable, and those who aren't already in the market find it almost impossible because Australia has been a country of home ownership since the post-war time. That's becoming less and less possible for most people. Home ownership rates for 18 to 35-year-olds are dropping dramatically. And in fact, in my state, at the last national census, there was more people who were renting, more households renting than purchasing a home. That's the first time that's happened in my lifetime. And so you see this big divide based on the ownership of property. And so I think the themes are exactly the same. The causes of them are slightly different, but and at the same time there's been, because nationally there's a rising private rental market. In Australia we have only about 4% of social housing, so most people are living in the private rental market, and it's a policy by default. We're seeing families with dependent children, older people, single parents. In fact, Karen's presentation just before just sounded like you could have been talking about Australia. We've got people living long-term and permanently in the private rental market, and we've got private rental market laws that allow you to be evicted without any grounds on short notice. There's a rising tide of people in Australia talking about tenancy law reform in all the states and territories, but at the same time there's a massive pushback from owners and property groups saying, oh no, we need more property rights, not housing rights. So that's sort of very the same theme occurring in Australia.
Yeah, Elizabeth?
Well, I was pretty oops, hello. Sorry for my English at first. I was very sad and angry to see that the human right is not respected, but the corporations, big corporations like Blackstone, their rights of making profits is better than the rights of humans to live in a decent dwelling. That's what's very shocking, and also that's happening everywhere, in Montreal also, but not as worse in Toronto, but all around the world, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah, I think the picture is a very vivid illustration that free markets are not able to provide affordable, adequate housing for a large group of people. But that being said, that's nothing new. And the former speaker from the Housing for All initiative already said that. That's not rocket science. markets need to be shaped in order to provide affordable homes. So it takes political courage to do that. And there's a lot to be said about that, but that's the basic, I think. So what you see is what happens when you do not take political responsibility.
Yeah, thank you very much. In the film, you will hear about the shift, and that's a worldwide movement to reclaim and realize the fundamental human rights to housing. And a lot of cities in the world has joined the shift to establish this reclaim. And I would like to ask the panel how we make the shift. And that's also an important question for you to discuss in the roundtable sessions, because we need to do something about the push. What do you say, Penny?
I don't think there's any easy solutions, and I think we have to act almost globally. That's what we're doing here now, but we also have to act very locally. So I suppose if I think about what's going on in my state, in my home, and across our country, I think the way we try, one of the primary ways, it's just one way, is to push tenancy law rights. Because if we had stronger tenancy law rights, then it would make it harder to get people out and push people, push rents up or take whatever action to evict without evicting. So we need to strengthen the rights. It's just very hard to do that in Australia. There's a psychological barrier to it. But I think we're only going to achieve significant change if we work from the ground up, because obviously corporations have a lot of power. There's a lot of laws that seem to be supporting their actions. It's only going to change if people connect and rise up in a sort of community, from communities, and push their own governments to make change. And so I suppose in some ways I think it's a classic campaign that we've got to run that engages people from the ground.
A classic campaign. What do you say, Elizabeth?
Well, I think that we're at the right place if we want to do something, because it's not only like you, me, or him that can do it alone, because it's people from the ground, and we are represented by people locally, provincially, and in the countries, and here we can decide what's important for all the countries. So that's why I think we should adopt politics that are strong, and like we said earlier, the carrot and also the stick.
Yeah, so housing finance is of course crucial to providing houses. Maybe good to mention that in the Netherlands, private initiatives in the early 1900s and even before that were the basic of social housing, not governments. So private investors is fine as long as the intentions are good. And I think I mentioned the carrots and the sticks. I think what we need to do is provide a well-defined set of instruments, deploying carrots if possible, but also using sticks if needed to channel finance into affordable housing. And Saskia Sasse in the trailer said about these corporate lawyers, oh boy, how are they able to deploy the law? So I think it needs even people better able to deploy the law and develop these instruments to really entice or maybe force investors to behave in a responsible way.
Can I add something?
Yes.
Sorry. I think we have to have politics that we adopt that imposes more social housing, because social housing is sheltered from speculations, and private rental housing is not sheltered from speculation.
Yeah. In Australia and perhaps in other countries, there is just no political commitment to increasing the stock of social and affordable housing. And I think that's something that we really have to change, because the private market has no competitor in Australia. So it's not like in Vienna. It has a very strong competitor here. And so investors are not, they're competing against first homeowners, and they're asset rich, and they're able to outbid them in purchase of housing.
what I see in the Netherlands is, for instance, a very still deep belief about what the market will do. So we talked about the Dutch case, where you could say housing, social housing has been limited to 40% of the population. I heard that in Vienna it's 80% is eligible for social housing. But a lot of residents in the Netherlands are not helped by the market. Even the other way around, the Dutch government is siphoning, is taxing social housing organizations to fill their own coffers. So there's still, although there's clear evidence that markets need to be shaped, it's still not the political courage to really do that.
Yeah. We keep saying in Australia we need a new social contract because the investors are getting tax subsidy and incentives, and in return what they need to be giving people living in the property is a quality product fit for purpose that provides some stability and security in their tenure. So it's a new, that's the catch cry we've been trying to push at the moment, a new social contract.
Yeah. In the movie, housing is described as a commodity. That's one of the big conclusions of the Push movie. What can we do about that? Elizabeth?
What's the question again, sorry?
What we can do about housing as a commodity?
Well, we should, once again, vote for politics that prevents those things from happening. Because housing is a right, isn't it?
Yes.
It's voted at UN, right?
Yes.
But how come if it's not respected, nothing happens? That's what we were talking about at the pause. If we vote something, we have to make it sure that locally it happens. And like in Montreal, we adopted a law that for Airbnbs, they have to pay more taxes. And now they can't be on everywhere, only on limited to commercial arteries. So that's the kind of little things that could help maybe. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, little things, but if we publicize it everywhere, then maybe we could learn from each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I like about the presentation about Vienna, I think it shows the power of local governments that are willing and able and have the courage to really develop not only housing policy, like nice words on paper, but really deploy that, have land policy, have financial instruments, have tenant rights, have the muscle power to enforce tenant rights. Mm-hmm. So what you see is that a lot of these problems triggered by this not very well functioning housing market can be solved on a local level. And of course, we also need to develop instruments on other levels, European level and also the national level, but a lot of that can be done locally. Yeah. And I see that also in Amsterdam, to a lesser extent, I must admit, but also there they're trying to really shape a market that creates affordable and adequate housing.
What about organizing tenants?
Sorry?
What about organizing tenants?
I think a classic campaign starts from the bottom and the top. So it's, I suppose, reflecting on the Australian. I think tenants in Australia are almost ready to be politically active, or at least some of them are. To date, they haven't really been, because tenancy's been a step towards home ownership, but it's just not that anymore. So we've been hearing tenant voices and a lot of the voices of young people who are locked out of the housing market. So I think there's a possibility to do that in Australia now. But I think it's finding our allies. So we just, the shift is about an international campaign. If we can link up an international campaign with little local campaigns, state campaigns, national campaigns. It's a big job though. Australia doesn't have a national housing policy, and we don't have a government that wants one. But there's some other governments have created some. The Canadian government, the Irish government, the New Zealand government all recently developed very good policies that include the private rental market and tenants' rights. So there's some little glimmers of hope there.
Yeah.
It's about the same thing.
Yeah, maybe I'm the guy advocating institutional instruments, but I think also involving tenants needs an institutional framework. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have a law obliging landlords to involve their tenants in important decisions. We have a regulation that enforces local authorities and housing associations to involve local tenant organizations in performance agreements. So it's a legal obligation to involve residents in important decisions. And I think that's a good framework. And based on that framework, you can really empower tenants to become active.
Yeah. Great ideas. An international campaign to establish the shift. How does that sound? Sounds good to me. A legal framework, of course. I think we will stop there. And we have a few minutes for questions to the panel. If Stefan can provide, if there are any questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the nice talk that we just heard. I want to hear your opinion about rent control, because it's a very specific and hot topic now in Portugal, but I think all over Europe. In Portugal, we had a very specific situation because we had frozen rents for more than half a century, since the 40s of the last century. And rent control became a myth, a taboo because of that. And what's your opinion? And besides the table, I would love to hear the opinion of my colleagues also here in the assembly. So it's really a myth and a taboo, and I know that there's several ways to control rents, because what we are talking now, and I was talking with Joanna back there in coffee, the local governments of the several cities that are here represented, they don't have much power to regulate. What we see is that the forces that are shaping the housing stock nowadays in the housing market are global. We are talking about transnational financialisation, financial fluxes. We are talking about demands that come from abroad, like a transnational elite, really motivated by national programs that attract foreign investment, and we could go on. So the forces that shape what is going on the rental market are global. And our national states are national, and our local governments are local. So how can we, because I think that the real problem is the speculative rents. So how can we, as organization, how can we deal with that? How can we, take some measures to mitigate that? Mm-hmm. But rent control, again. Yeah. What do you think about rent control and how to do it, and if it works, if it doesn't work? Okay.
Go ahead. I think rent control is a good idea. If I said rent control in Australia, it's anathema to the private market in Australia. I'd be like a pariah. So I suppose we talk about it, we don't really use the word rent control. We use a lot of things around rent control that smell like rent control, but they're not called rent control. So the closest that we're coming, because at the moment we have a tenancy law campaign running. We're going to have some tenancy law changes towards the end of the year in the state where I live. We just can't talk about rent control because we wouldn't be taken very seriously. And so what we do is to try to talk about limiting the number of rent increases, and if an increase is above a certain amount over the indexed increases, that has to be justified. But even that is a really hard sell in Australia. So I think so the other way that we're looking at it is to try to get it in as a regulation that the government could use if there was natural disasters. So, and something that could, just as a soft way to get the idea socialised into the system. But I think in and of itself, it's probably a necessity.
Yeah. From a Dutch context, we already have a quite regulated rental market, also rent control. I do think that private investors have the right to a decent profit. Sometimes rent regulation does not make that possible, so there's too much rent control. Maybe if rents are frozen for half a century. But on the other hand, it can also be too loose, and it leads to speculative situations, tenant insecurity. So I think rent control, as I said, so housing markets are grossly flawed. So it's not a well-functioning market. So you need somehow some instruments to shape that market and regulate that market. So rent control and tenant rights are part of the way you shape the market. But it's also kind of nuanced, so how you do that without chasing away people that want to invest their money in rental housing.
Well, in Quebec, we have the rent control, but the real thing, it doesn't really work when you get to, there's a ways to pass by it, so like rent eviction, and when it's like they take a rent, a flat, and they just renovate it like excessively, and it makes it like they push the people away. And all the people that live there for like years, they have to go to live in the suburbs, they can't afford it anymore. Or even if the rent is still there, but around the rent, there's a lot of luxury apartments that are being built, and there's like commerces and restaurants, and the people that live there that for 50 years, they can't afford it anymore. They have to leave. That's the thing is, even if rent control exists, the people can't live in the city anymore.
Okay, I think that's an excellent question also to address in the round panel sessions. Yes, Stefan.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. The tenants movement really is integrated with the sustainable cities agenda, which is current. And we wonder to what extent we can make a connection. We're rather pleased coming to this meeting and to know that the IUT is now putting housing as a human right, which of course is making a connection with the United Nations agenda. We just wondered whether nationally or more so globally within IUT, we could look at how the tenants' rights, the affordability of housing can be put at the center of the sustainable cities movement, and to what extent we can make some connection with the lenders. I know it sounds rather optimistic, but after all, if none of the gentrification can take place, none of what is taking place could happen without the investors, and Professor would understand that. And I just really wonder whether that should be, be brought into the agenda. How do we connect with the investors?
Yeah, happy to respond to that question. In the Netherlands, we also have a problem of not enough affordable housing. So what we try to do is create roundtables. So we also have roundtables here. We also have roundtables in the Netherlands. So inviting tenant organizations, but also investors in housing to see how we can develop solutions to increase the investment in affordable housing. So connecting these different parties. But that's very difficult. I don't see a lot of concrete results happening at the moment, I'm afraid.
And let me also address the responsibility of our politicians, because that's one thing that I think is not addressed in the Push movie. In Sweden, for instance, there are political decisions that sells out the cities. So it's not just the financial markets, it's also the politicians, I think.
Can I add to that? Because I think that's one of the important things missing in the Netherlands, that there's not a lot of political courage to really enforce that. But it's kind of talking towns or talking people, but not really initiatives from policymakers.
Yeah, Eddie.
Yes, I am Eddie Jacquemart from France. So we are speaking about how to fight against speculation, and I am very interested by the remark of the representative of the Union of Tenants of Quebec. She said we need to have social housing in our city to fight against speculation. So I would like to know what do you think about, for example, in France, we have a special law who obliged the city to build, for example, 25% of housing, of social housing in the city. If you don't build this social housing or public housing in your city, you have a penalty. The city have a penalty. So what do you think about it? And it could be very interesting, perhaps, to all together, like Union of Tenants, to try to have this kind of law, because it's not only in France. I know, for example, in Barcelona, we have this kind of subject. So it could be a very interesting to fight against speculation. Thank you.
Elizabeth?
Well, in Quebec, well, in Montreal, because it's more decided on a local basis. In Montreal, we have voted a law. It's 2020. It's 20% of social housing. Well, when we build 50 units or more, you have to have 20% of social housing, 20% of affordable housing, and 20% of family housing, destined for family, so that the people can stay in the city, and the rest is private sector. But the real thing is that, once again, it's not totally working, because private investors, they don't really care about social housing. So they prefer to pay the penalty, and that goes into a fund, which is better than nothing, right? But still, it would be like a bigger carrot if there's something more, you know, that would interest them more. But if the country, the province, and the locally, they would vote something that oblige them to do so, I think that it would be straightened. That measure would be straightened. I don't know if there's something somewhere else that has that kind of law or that kind of...
A lot of cities are using these kinds of land policies to make sure that there's sufficient of adequate housing, like in Vienna, like 2/3 should be affordable. Also in Amsterdam, we have a different percentage, so it's 40-40-20, so 40% social housing, 40% mid-segment, and 20% more expensive. But then the challenge is, how do you make sure that it's still that way in 10 years' time? And how can you enforce it that it will really be delivered?
Yeah, we call it in Australia inclusionary zoning, and I think it's decided by the local councils. So it's patchy and it comes and goes as councils come and go also. So we're very strong supporters of the idea of inclusionary zoning, though. And there was in the previous state government, they were very conservative, and they removed a law that allowed the local council to do that for a while. And so we've got these massive developments that are all private, they are like thousands of units over several stages of a development area that are going to have no social housing them right in the middle of the city. So it's a crime.
Okay, we'll take the last question.
This is really a question about the extent to which all tenants of different kind of tenancies are able to come together in order to fight on this front. Because again, I would comment on the idea of social housing as a shelter. I come from England, and at the same time as there is a movement for more rights, especially for private tenants, and that's within the country, at the same time, social housing tenants have seen their rights cut back drastically, whereas you would have a long-term indefinite tenancy, providing you didn't break it. Then the government introduced first of all, introductory tenancies, now 5 years fixed-term tenancies. Everybody then has to be reassessed. And I think the lesson from this is that no group will get rights by other people losing rights. And if there are examples from the panel of tenants who have different but also problems coming together, because I think that the politicians who've been criticised here have been able to pick off different groups by talking about social housing tenants as people who've got something that nobody else has got and nobody else will be able to get in our situation. So.
It's a very similar situation in Australia. Social housing has become residualised. It's decreased in size because nobody's putting the resources into it. And as a result, there's a growing number, and housing purchase is unaffordable, so there's this growing number of people that are in the private rental market. And instead of dealing with the political issue of putting more money into housing, the politicians are just changing the deck chairs in social housing. So by policy, not legislation, people had indefinite tenure in social housing, and they don't really have that in general in Australia anymore. And you have to be very high needs to get into it to start with, and you know, they'll try to get you out if you have an income over a certain amount. There's a whole bunch of sort of new policies. That's by policy, not legislation. The legislation, the tenancy law, is actually the same. So I'd agree with you. But it's very hard in Australia to mobilise private rental market tenants. And I don't really know why. I suspect it's because it's not a very respected tenure. It was always a tenure you just stopped in for a while on the way to buying. It's not now. It's not that anymore. But I still think we think about it like that. And there's a stigma about it. People don't really identify as a private renter. They just want to be a home buyer in the future.
Yeah.
Private rental in the Netherlands is a growing sector. Traditionally, the Dutch tenant union focused on the social housing tenants, but you see this growing group that needs additional attention and is less organized. So we're also seeking ways to support them in a better way than we did before, because the group is growing. So that's really a good and timely issue.
Yeah, I think we will stop there, and many thanks to the international panel, and just take with you Lailana's word that gold is a commodity, housing is not. It is a basic human right. Thank you very much. Yeah. And okay.
I think the round table has happened in the room now, so I think